all. My name is Katie Erickson. I'm Ingram's Senior Director of Education here at the Michael C. Carlos Museum. And I would just love to welcome all of you for joining us for this lecture, both in person and virtually. Thank you all for your flexibility. We are so excited to be able to welcome Dr. Rune Nyord for the lecture, No Other Satisfactory Reason Can Be Given, the European Discovery of the Ancient Egyptian Afterlife. Dr. Nyord is the Assistant Professor of Ancient Egyptian Art and Archaeology here at Emory, as well as the Samuel H. Kress Senior Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts in Washington, D.C. Tonight, Dr. Nyord will be examining how the modern understanding of the ancient Egyptians has been bent on a quest for eternal life, is the result of a long history of Western engagements with ancient Egypt. We're thrilled to be able to welcome this topic and Dr. Nyord into the Carlos, so that we can look at the field of Egyptology in a way that is both new conversations, critical examination, and introducing new topics into the conversation. This lecture is offered in conjunction with the exhibition Life in the Afterlife, Ancient Egyptian Art from the Senuseret Collection, on view currently at the Carlos Museum, and is made possible through the Lacavara Lecture Fund. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Nyord.
Thank you very much indeed for this kind introduction, and thank you to all our participants for joining in either one place or another. I'm very sorry not to be able to be with you in person this evening. Gods of travel didn't will it, so I will be talking to you here from Washington, D.C. The conceptual framework surrounding ancient Egyptian mortuary culture is quite well established. I've taken a relatively random selection of museum catalogues here, looking at the kind of terminology that's used to conceptualize the ancient Egyptian funerary culture. So we are seeing things like afterlife, immortality, eternity, and often there's some sort of moving around involved as well. There's a quest or a search or a journey. Now the core vocabulary here is not Egyptian, as any Egyptologist will be able to tell you. They didn't have words for things like afterlife or immortality and so on. And it's quite obvious that many of these ideas, as they are applied in modern languages, in fact come from Christianity. Now, that does not, of course, mean that the terminology is wrong in any simple sense. But it does raise a question which I think is of interest, and which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, namely what historically has been the balance between European and ancient Egyptian ideas in the production of knowledge about ancient Egyptian funerary culture. So to explore that question today, I'll be tracking a long trajectory of European ideas over several centuries, up until the establishment of the present framework, as exemplified, for instance, by the catalogues here in the late 19th century. That vast time span, of course, means that I will be forced to look primarily at some main developments and key turning points, with a few examples singled out for closer analysis as examples. John Gardner Wilkinson, whom we see depicted here, spent over a decade in Egypt in the 1820s and 1830s. He was working, in particularly studying the painted rock tombs at Thebes, which he was interested in order to be able to write an ethnography, or in the parlance of the time, manners and customs of the ancient Egyptians, looking at how they went about their daily life, what technology they had, what kind of clothes they wore, what kind of rituals they performed, and that sort of thing. As part of that, he also has a lengthy discussion on mortuary religion, which is instructive for how this topic was approached, not just in the 19th century, but also earlier in the early modern period. So let's have a look at the quote here to sort of delineate some of the approaches that are at stake here. So Wilkinson writes, "We are therefore still in uncertainty respecting the actual intentions of the Egyptians in thus preserving the body." So he's talking about mummification, as we'll return to in a minute, and ornamenting their sepulchres at so great an expense. Nor is there any decided proof that the resurrection of the body was a tenet of their religion. It is, however, highly probable that such was their belief, since no other satisfactory reason can be given for the great care of the body after death. So there are a couple of things here that are quite characteristic of the way that ancient Egyptian mortuary religion historically has been approached. Firstly, we can note that he begins, his point of departure is a framing in terms of sort of a binary yes-no question regarding what is essentially the Christian dogma of the resurrection of the body. So the question about Egyptian beliefs is posed in terms of whether or not they held a particular Christian belief. The second characteristic thing here is the deductive approach. So the way to answer it, in this case, we don't have a smoking gun, as it were, to show that the Egyptians did or did not believe this. And so we proceed deductively. What kind of explanations might one be able to come up with when looking at a practice like mummification? And he says that no other satisfactory reason can be given. In other words, a belief in the resurrection of the body would explain the practice of mummification, and no other available dogma that one could imagine sort of would offer the same kind of explanation, meaning that it becomes highly probable that such was their belief, as he writes. And that leads us to the third characteristic point, that by posing the question in this way and by proceeding to answer it in this way, very often scholars tended to come up with relatively predictable answers. So from the fact that we are asking whether they believed in the resurrection of the body, and we approached it as a question of seeking or imagining possible explanations, meaning that we end up with a positive answer to that to that question. Now, we need to go back quite a lot earlier, though, if we want to trace the development of some of the key ideas that are still with us today. Some of the key ideas are, in fact, established as early as medieval times, as exemplified here, when Egypt was not quite the completely unknown factor that it's sometimes presented as. It was, after all, quite close to the Holy Land, and people went there on pilgrimage journeys, and quite a few of them actually wrote about their visits to Egypt. So it wasn't wholly unknown, but certainly ancient Egyptian mortuary religion was not a prevalent concern of Europeans in the Middle Ages. It's fair to say. One of the ideas that can sort of illustrate that is that the key ancient Egyptian achievement of the pyramids was not widely understood as being funerary in nature at all. In fact, there was a prevalent tradition which can be traced back to late antiquity, according to which the pyramids were the granaries of Joseph. So in the story of Joseph in Genesis, he famously constructs granaries to store the surplus of the bountiful years, so that food will be available during the 7 years of famine following. An interesting example of this tradition is found here in the Hereford Mappa Mundi, where we can see that this idea of the pyramids as granaries of Joseph was not only transmitted in relation to the actual visual shape of the pyramids, but also as a linguistic, a textual idea. We can tell that that's the case because we have a number of things here connected to Egypt. So we have the lighthouse of Alexandria down here, for instance, and then up here we have, according to the text, the granaries of Joseph. However, they're depicted not as pyramids, as we can see here, but the way that a medieval artist might imagine a granary is something like a medieval hall, a guild hall, or something along those lines. So clearly, the idea that the granaries of Joseph were in Egypt was connected to, or what was transmitted as a textual, as a linguistic idea, rather than as an image of actual pyramids. But the key idea that was nonetheless established at this early stage was that the ancient Egyptians mummified bodies to preserve them for eternity. Again, this is a core idea about Egyptian mortuary religion to this day, and it's found quite early on. There were three main contributors to establishing this idea. One of them was simply that looking at mummified bodies from ancient Egypt, they did in fact preserve details such as facial features that belied the undoubtedly long time that they had been dead, and so the effects of preserving the body was assumed to also be the purpose for the Egyptians. Of course, strictly speaking, there is a logical fallacy here, even though the bodies in fact turn out to have been preserved for a long time. That doesn't necessarily mean that that was precisely what the Egyptians wanted. So that it seems a reasonable supposition, but it's not. There's no strict logical connection there. The second reason for arriving at this conclusion was that the materiality of the mummified bodies, especially the black gum-like substance that surrounds mummified bodies, was connected with the efficacious material known as mumia, which was originally a reference to a sort of bitumen or asphalt that you could find in nature, but it was assumed that the Egyptians used this material to preserve the bodies, and because that material was understood to have various healing properties, it sort of fitted quite nicely with the Egyptians treated their dead with mumia, and for that reason they had lasted for a long time. So again, it sort of adds up. And indeed, the main reason that people were interested in mummies in this period was precisely to be able to extract this powerful and valuable substance from them. So there's a mutual strengthening of those ideas present. Finally, at the same time, there is a growing interest in embalming of bodies in Europe. In the first instance, as far as we can tell, for relatively practical reasons, long-distance travel became more prevalent, and especially the very dangerous kind connected to activities like the Crusades, where it was quite likely that kings or high-ranking nobles would travel far away abroad. And many would, in fact, lose their lives and would be needed to be brought back to Europe for burial. Later on, interest also developed in embalming for more theological and religious reasons. But in any case, the aim in the European embalming processes was precisely that of preserving the body. So once again, it became even more reasonable to suppose that the same thing was true for the ancient Egyptians. Now, with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, of course, there was a turning point in European intellectual history in general, and that was also true of thinking about ancient Egyptian mortuary religion. For our purposes, it was especially the new availability of classical authors writing on Egyptian mortuary religion that spurred on an interest in this question, going beyond just speculating about why they might have made pyramids or why they might have mummified bodies, but actually connecting those extant remnants of ancient Egyptian culture with writings from classical authors. Chief among the classical authors that became of interest during this period was the histories of the 5th century BCE Greek historian Herodotus of Halicarnassus. He describes various cultures of the Mediterranean as a backdrop to the Greco-Persian Wars, and he spends a particularly large amount of time and energy on describing the Egyptian culture. He's not chiefly interested in Egyptian mortuary religion, it's fair to say, but he does have a couple of lengthy passages that ended up being quite soon connected to attempts to understand ancient Egyptian mortuary religion. One of those passages is a lengthy description of the different methods of mummification. That is one of the few passages from Herodotus that are actually still quoted to this day as being sort of a main contributor, one should say, to understanding that particular phenomenon. There's another passage that is somewhat mysterious, and that people immediately got very attracted to. So it's worth looking at that in a little more detail. Herodotus is not, by and large, terribly interested in what the ancient Egyptians believed, why they built funerary monuments, and why they mummified bodies, despite the long description of the practical ways of doing that. But he does have this passage here in a completely separate place that doesn't relate to mummification at all. So Herodotus writes here, and the Egyptians are also the first who reported the doctrine that the soul of man is immortal, and that when the body dies, the soul enters into another creature, which chances then to be coming to the birth. And when it has gone the round of all the creatures of land and sea and of the air, it enters again into a human body as it comes to the birth. And that it makes this round in a period of 3,000 years. There's a lot of things one could potentially say here. There are a couple of key ambiguities that later scholars would employ in different ways. One of the perhaps most striking things is what is not here. So we have an idea of the soul going into to animals, and the soul has to sort of sequentially go through every animal species. Now, readers of other texts becoming available at this time, such as Plato or the so-called Hermetic writings connected to the Egyptian god Hermes Trismegistus, a form of the god Thoth, who was believed to be the author of these texts, would be familiar with an idea of the the soul moving into animal bodies, but as a sort of reward or punishment, so that a soul that has lived a noble life would go into a human being or a noble animal, whereas someone who has lived a bad, a sinful life would have to enter an animal body that sort of fitted the temperament that soul had exhibited. But we don't find that in Herodotus. However, by combining Herodotus with those other authors, the Hermetic writings were immediately connected to Egypt, and Plato was often understood in the later tradition as having been educated or otherwise steeped in Egyptian wisdom, and so he might actually be thought to be talking from a point of view of Egyptian ideas. So by sort of thinking Herodotus together with some of those other authors, one could squeeze in a notion of reward and punishment here. So as it happens, the European scholars of the time, and indeed of later times, were really keen to introduce this element of judgment and reward and punishment, not just because it could be with a little bit of goodwill, you could extract that from passages like this one, but also, and perhaps especially, because the Egyptians were clearly very invested in funerary culture, and the most obvious reason for that, from a Christian point of view, would be that they were seeking the salvation of the soul. And if there is a question as to the salvation of the soul, then probably that has to do with some sort of post-mortem judgment. So that was it. That was of interest to be able to make that connection. Although we also get quite a different picture here of what happens to the soul when you die, and among other things, this passage could be used to explain why the Egyptians mummified animals, for instance, and another sort of striking fact about ancient Egyptian culture. If it's the same kind of soul that is circulating, becoming reincarnated in both human bodies and animal bodies, then it sort of makes sense that you would mummify at least the more noble animals containing the higher quality souls, if you're using that sort of Platonic framework as well. Another very influential writer in this regard is first century BCE historian Diodorus of Sicily, who wrote a universal history of the Eastern Mediterranean world, beginning from the Trojan War and the sort of legendary past that preceded the Trojan War. He also is very interested in Egypt, and in particular the way in which Egyptian customs could serve to enhance morality, which is something that in turn also would interest later Europeans. Again, I've singled out one particular passage that comes up over and over again, and that also is slightly open to interpretations, so that we find different ways of using it in later scholars. So Diodorus writes, then when the judges, 42 in number, have assembled and have taken seats in a hemicycle which was built across the lake, the baris, a kind of boat, is launched, which has been prepared in advance. At any rate, after the baris has been launched into the lake, but before the coffin containing the body is set in it, the law gives permission to anyone who wishes to arraign the dead person. Now, if anyone presents himself and makes a charge and shows that the dead man had led an evil life, the judges announce the decision to all, and the body is denied the customary burial. Now, he goes on to say that the Greeks misunderstood all this and thought that it was mythology. It was a description of the underworld, but in fact, this is a ritual that's being carried out by living judges, and living accusers can come forward to sort of influence whether a person has the right to burial or not. Once again, because it deals with post-mortem judgment, you could sort of fiddle with the details to make this fit into a more expected Christian mold of a transcendent or a divine judgment. So it becomes less a human ritual and more an event taking place in the afterlife, or both at once. Again, that there are sort of details that you can play around with in different ways depending on what it is you want to achieve with your discussion of Egyptian mortuary religion. Oops. So if we just look at those two key passages, we have sort of two different routes that one can take. One is an othering approach, an approach where ancient Egypt is set aside as being something quite different from European Christianity, and Herodotus can be useful for that. We focus on mummification, obviously an exotic practice, and then the notion of the transmigration of the soul that later European scholars would connect to places like the Far East. So that again could be used to show that Egyptians were very different from Christians. On the other hand, Diodorus, by focusing on this notion of a post-mortem judgment, that immediately brings forward the associations with the Last Judgment in Christianity, and so it's useful for universalizing approaches if we want to show that all peoples around the earth believe similar things and have similar aspirations. Then that is useful, and also just in general an ethical approach. Clearly, if you're judged after death, whether it's by humans or by gods for that matter, that can be used as a way to make people lead moral lives, sort of as a stick and carrot sort of situation. Now, quite shortly after these classical authors became entrenched as authoritative sources of knowledge of ancient Egypt, Europe was shook by the intellectual and in many cases social and military upheavals of the Reformation, where a number of details were rethought, including details of Christian mortuary religion. For instance, the notion of purgatory as a place of painful purification of souls that had need for purification but had not led lives that were so sinful as to cause eternal damnation, with many Protestant denominations rejecting this idea, along with the various social practices, so that the famous criticism of indulgences and these kind of things that also led to a rejection of purgatory. Now that doesn't mean that only Catholic interpreters attributed purgatory-like processes to ancient Egypt, but quite often when such ideas are deployed to Egyptian religion to understand it, we can sort of detect a tint depending on whether the scholar in question is a Protestant or a Catholic. An example of ancient Egypt being deployed in these kind of debates is provided by Henri de Spond, whom we see here. He was a Calvinist, so a Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism, and he wrote the book that we see here on the left on sacred cemeteries. Now, France during the 16th century was plagued by long-lasting, the so-called French wars of religion, and they ended at the end of the 16th century when King Henry IV converted to Catholicism, and he instituted the so-called Edict of Nantes in 1598, which established religious tolerance, including one of the key things that people had been disagreeing about, namely whether Protestants should have the right to burial in Catholic cemeteries. Now, obviously, if you were not allowed to bury your dead in a Catholic cemetery, which by definition were the cemeteries belonging to the church, that was a major problem, and in fact, it had been a significant contributor to the hostilities during the earlier part of the century. However, as a convert to Catholicism, Despond was very much against this idea of religious tolerance, and the sole purpose of his book is to argue why Calvinist Protestants should not be allowed to be buried in Catholic cemeteries. Now, what on earth does that have to do with ancient Egyptian mortuary religion? Well, what Despond is out to show is how every human culture has a particular set of ideas about rights to burial. So the sacredness of burial grounds, which is alluded to in the title, but also the idea that people of other faiths are not allowed to be buried in the cemetery belonging to one faith, and so on. So he goes through the major human cultures, and one of those that are very famous for their burial practices, of course, is ancient Egypt. So because he has that agenda, he's very much out to assimilate Egyptians with Christianity. He wants to show that what the Christians did, and by the way, also what the Greeks did and what the Romans did, by slightly different tokens, are all sort of natural, innate human drives towards how one should deal with the dead, and so for that reason, his contemporary Catholics should do the same thing. So, for instance, that leads to the idea that the Egyptians also believed in the resurrection of the body, and like Gardner Wilkinson, much later, as we saw, he saw that connected to the practice of mummification. So this is an example of a very explicitly polemical deployment of the ancient Egyptian mortuary religion, and it's also an example of a clearly assimilating approach to Egypt. He's searching for the things that connect ancient Egypt with his contemporary Christianity, in order to be able to show that as universal human values. Another quite different example of a familiarizing approach, somewhat later in the late 17th century, is provided by Jacques Bénigne-Bossuet, who was a French bishop, and he was tutor to the crown prince, the Dauphin, and he wrote the book in order to provide a teaching for the future monarch, drawing lessons from different episodes of world history as a way to educate a future absolute monarch in the 17th century. To show the kind of approach that he takes, we can once again see that by assimilating Egyptian mortuary religion to Christianity, you can achieve particular effects. And in this case, then it's a matter of really taking the Egyptians as a sort of role model, or showing someone that had similar ideas to contemporary France, in order to sort of be able to draw wisdom from it. So he writes here, this custom of judging kings after death, so this is taken from Diodorus, who also has a passage saying that it's not just ordinary humans that are being judged after death, but also kings. And since this is written for a future king, that becomes particularly relevant. So this custom of judging kings after death seemed so just to the people of God that they always practiced it. This is the Israelites. We see in the scriptures how unjust kings were deprived the burial of their ancestors, and we learn from Josephus that the custom lasted even to the time of the Asmoneans. This made the kings understand that if their majesty put them above human judgments during their lives, they would come back to them in the end, as death made them equal to other men. So this is an example of what I talked about earlier, that it's quite easy in a sense to assimilate the ritual that Diodorus describes with a divine post-mortem judgment. That means that you can actually compare directly the kind of ideas that you see among the Israelites, and ultimately also the Christian kings of Bossuet's own time, who are being judged by God after death, with the practices described by Diodorus as being judged after death, albeit by human beings. So by making that assimilation, it becomes quite easy to imagine also that in fact the ancient Egyptians believed they were judged by the gods after death, and that's an idea that slightly later scholars would latch onto. To take an example of the othering approach, the approach of putting ancient Egyptian mortuary religion in a completely different category from Christianity, we can take the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher. He had this idea of ancient Egypt as being a mixture of two different strands of ideas, one of them being derived from God's teaching of Adam. So these are sound, wholesome ideas like monotheism and other ideas that would continue ultimately down to Christianity. And then a set of ideas connected to the biblical Cain that are sort of magical and superstitious ideas that are the ones that need to be othered. So he can sort of navigate the territory of Egyptian ideas by dividing them into one category or the other. And then, not surprisingly, metempsychosis, or the kind of reincarnation that Herodotus describes, is an example of the superstitious strand of Egyptian thinking that is sort of in contrast to the true teaching that can find connecting points with Christianity. And in Kircher's model, those ideas spread from Egypt to other places in the Mediterranean, as far as China. So Egypt is the place of origin of this dogma of metempsychosis, or reincarnation. As an example of his sort of very diffusionist ideas, where ideas are they originate in Egypt and they go elsewhere, we can take an example that was relatively recent in Kircher's time, from Jewish mysticism, where he's citing Elia Levita's analysis of the name Adam. So in Hebrew, Adam consists of these three consonants, Aleph, a D, and an M, and Levita argues that shows that it's the same soul that becomes incarnate first in Adam, as evidenced by the initial Aleph, then in David as King David, as shown by the initial D, and will finally become incarnated in the Messiah, as indicated by the M. So these three consonants are the one that make up the name Adam, and that show in a germinal form the future incarnations of that. So there are lots of examples like that in Kircher. He's really tracking these ideas wherever he finds them in a range of different cultures that he argues all had them originally from Egypt. So this is an example of an othering approach where he sets out to show how Egypt is different. So whether one chooses one approach or another, there is a tendency to emphasize the ethical dimension of Egyptian mortuary religion, to some extent simply because that is what European scholars found interesting, this idea of post-mortem judgment, either the sort of sociological notion that can make people behave, that was interesting to Bossuet, for instance, or just the notion that the Egyptians invested so much in funerary culture, and so that had to, in one way or another, mean that something was at stake, that there was a risk of damnation and a promise of salvation. So one way that could happen is through reincarnation as different kinds of animals as rewards of punishment for conduct during life. Again, that's not what Herodotus says, but you can connect those ideas with Plato or with other authors in order to establish that notion. Another way is through reinterpretation, approximating Diodorus's ritual judgment with the Christian last judgment, as we've also seen that's quite an easy association to make. Either way, the result is an emphasis on judgment resulting in rewards and punishments in the afterlife, which of course is an approximation to Christian ideas rather than ideas that are actually found in either Herodotus or Diodorus or really any of the other ancient authors. Here we are. Okay, sorry, I'll just go back. In the 18th century, we get a new idea that is also by now quite familiar to students of ancient Egyptian culture in general, funerary culture in particular, namely the notion of initiation, the idea that there is hidden wisdom, and the Egyptians had a sort of system of initiation where some people were allowed to learn these secrets and others were not. The priest and classical scholar Jean Terrasson wrote a novel which was presented as a pseudo-translation. So it's presented as an ancient manuscript in Greek that Terrasson translates. And it's a story about an Egyptian prince called Sethos, who experiences a number of different things, but in particular, he is initiated under the Great Pyramid. Now, by this time, it was well established that the pyramids were tombs. So this is sort of a deliberate reinterpretation where Terrasson presents the Great Pyramid as being a site of initiation rather than a site of burial. And through that initiation, Sethos goes through a series of trials to learn the truth that there's a secret priesthood living underground in the compartments under the pyramid. Now, this idea became hugely influential in esoteric thinking about ancient Egypt, perhaps most famously in Mozart's The Magic Flute, where we get this sort of a combination of Egyptian mythology with the idea of tests and trials, initiation. So this leads to a notion of a deep-seated split between overt and secret teachings. This is what Egyptologist Jan Assmann has recently termed religio duplex, double religion. So there's not just one Egyptian religion, but there's an exoteric and outward religion, and there's an esoteric hidden religion for initiates only. So what does that have to do with mortuary religion specifically? Well, as shown by the fact that the initiation takes place under the Great Pyramid, there is an approximation between mortuary and initiatory themes here that would continue. So it's in a sense quite a small step from saying that priests are getting initiated under the Great Pyramid to saying that the dead also have to go through an initiation, a series of trials when they die. So there's that sort of approximation, even if Towson doesn't say it explicitly. In the late 18th century, we get a new sort of empirical approach where different travelers are focusing more on precise documentation of the kind of monuments they see, and an idea of gathering sort of encyclopedically the entire set of knowledge about ancient Egypt that could be derived from different sources. A good example of this is the massive volume that we see here, which is ostensibly on the obelisks of Rome, but really covers a vast territory and gathers a huge amount of details about ancient Egyptian culture in general, including lengthy discussions of mortuary religion. As an example of this new empirical approach, we can look at Zoegas. We just saw it depicted here, the author of the book on obelisks, at his analysis of, in this case, a coffin in the British Museum that he discusses based on a 1724 engraving of the scene, and the sort of empirical approach of the time and going into the early 19th century is very much based on taking the ideas that were already present, such as the notion of the importance of judgment, and attaching them to particular emblems or images in ancient Egypt. So, for instance, we see here Osiris of the underworld holding the office of judge and promising to reward the souls. So this is not something that we can find directly in any of the classical authors, but as we've seen, that idea of judgment and rewards of the souls has sort of risen to the surface in an indirect way because it was a strong expectation by European scholars, and now that conceptual idea can latch on to Egyptian images. So we get these tightly packed notions of evidence of facts about Egypt and Egyptian religion. The year after the publication of Zoegas' book, Napoleon invaded Egypt for geopolitical reasons that didn't from the outset have much to do with ancient Egypt, but along with him, he famously brought a large group of savants who were meant to document the country, both the natural and cultural history, in order to sort of connect the colonial project to a project of production of knowledge, colonialism in a different sense. as we've just seen, the sort of seminal nature of this has been slightly overstated in traditional scholarship. In fact, we've seen very similar things happening earlier in the late 18th century. But nonetheless, in many quarters of the world, the publication of the Description de l'Egypte that resulted from the activities of the scholars did become very influential. One of the things that were published in the Description de l'Egypte is a papyrus version of basically the same scene that Zoëga analyzed, which sort of cements the idea that what is depicted here is an ancient Egyptian equivalent to the Last Judgment, where the salvation or damnation of the soul is being determined. So once again, the empirical, quote-unquote empirical approach really consists of mapping pre-existing concepts onto to Egyptian images that can then be used as handy illustrations, as indeed this scene is to this day. The corollary of the idea that this scene here depicts the Last Judgment is that the rest of the images in the Book of the Dead, the kind of funerary papyri that we see depicted here, must also describe other aspects of the afterlife. And this idea, in turn, is helped along by those initiatory ideas about trials and tribulations. Again, if Cetas had to undergo trials under the Great Pyramid, then it's a small step to imagine that the soul must also undergo trials and initiation in the afterlife. In a similar way, one of the authors of the Description, called Edme François Jomard, identifies this wall scene here from the tomb of Ramesses VI as evidence of metempsychosis. As we've talked about, one of the ideas that one could sort of interpolate in Herodotus's text is that the soul would get incarnated in unsavory animals if it had conducted itself badly during life. And what we seem to see here, once again, Osiris is seated. We have the balance weighing the souls, and then we have a pig being chased away. So it became established as the idea that this was a depiction of a bad soul being incarnated in a pig and chased back to Earth. It's going in the opposite direction from the souls that are coming from Earth to be judged. It might be expected at this point that in 1822 we were going to have a huge turning point in the understanding of ancient Egyptian mortuary religion, but that actually turns out not to be the case. It would take a good long while before lengthy connected religious text would be translated to the point where they could feed into these discussions in any meaningful way. And we see a good example of that here, where in 1838, the physician James Cowles Pritchard, who was very keenly interested in Egyptian mythology, wrote that it was at one time very generally expected that the clue afforded by the Rosetta inscription toward the deciphering of Egyptian hieroglyphics and incorporeal writings would have led to very important discoveries with respect to the religious notions and practices and the philosophical dogmas of the Egyptian priests. Hitherto, little or nothing has been obtained to verify this sanguine hope. It may indeed be questioned whether from this source it could have been discovered that the remarkable doctrine of the metempsychosis was held by the Egyptians. So in other words, we still need the classical authors, and in his case, we also need cross-cultural comparison. As you can see, he's comparing the ancient Egyptians to the Indians and other nations of antiquity. So it's kind of an updated early 19th century version of the same universalist project that Kircher was also doing. In 1842, we finally get a full publication of the text of a version of the Book of the Dead. By this time, the hypothesis that the Book of the Dead contained a literal description of what happened in the afterlife had been quite strongly entrenched. And for that reason, the Book of the Dead, once it became available in more detail, became a central document. It was really the go-to place in the second half of the 19th century, where you could basically look up any text passage, any image in the Book of the Dead, and get a snapshot of things happening in the afterlife. I do have a translation of the text here. So Lepsius writes, for instance, that is the first part of the Book of the Dead, concerns, according to the title, the appearance in light, that is the transfiguration, Erklärung, of the deceased, the final goal of the transmigration of souls. This is shown pictorially just after the funeral in the tomb, from which he goes forth alive. All the intermediary steps found no pictorial expression and are only briefly and partially touched upon in the individual chapters. So there's a good amount of leeway for interpreting or making the connection between what is actually found in the manuscript and the sort of overall conception of what happens in the afterlife. So he uses the notion of transfiguration now, another idea that's taken from Christianity. We have the transfiguration of Christ here as described in various Gospels. What it means is that he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. So he's talking conversing with the prophets of old in this transfigured state. So this is the notion that Lepsius chooses to express the goal of the Book of the Dead. Now, today, of course, we hardly ever speak of metempsychosis or reincarnation in connection with ancient Egyptian mortuary religion. This is because from being extremely important in really from the late 15th century and up until the early to mid 19th century, it starts to be sidelined. And the reason for this is not so much as we might expect that people couldn't find evidence of metempsychosis in the Book of the Dead or in the tombs that were becoming available. In fact, they could, as we've seen, for instance, in the example with the pig scene. But rather, it's because conceptually the idea had become redundant. As we saw, it was introduced to begin with, partly because Herodotus says so, but especially to establish this notion of post-mortem rewards and punishments that people were really keen to find and to connect with ancient Egyptian mortuary religion. So, as we've also seen, imagery from tombs, coffins, and Books of the Dead gradually established the importance of post-mortem judgment by other means, by having that pre-existing concept latch on to particular Egyptian images. We now have the appearance that those interpretations, the idea that there was a post-mortem judgment of and rewards and punishments of ethical behavior or lack of same, that was sort of arising organically from the material itself rather than really needing classical authors to establish it. So metempsychosis in a way becomes redundant because we already have a more authoritative way to establish the idea that metempsychosis was used to establish in the first place. For a little while, it's kept in the model either as elite priestly speculation in contrast to a popular belief, or as a purgatorial sort of temporary purification that people had to undergo, again, similar to purgatory in Catholicism. But even that part of the model is ultimately dropped as Protestant denominations had done, and even Catholics in the 19th century were discussing the sort of the need and cogency for the notion of purgatory. Yes. So we have a shift then in the sources that feed into Egyptian religion, with the classical authors actually still playing a major role, because they were used along with Christian expectations to establish particular interpretations of Egyptian imagery. But seemingly, since those scaffolds fall away during the late 19th century, we are left with an image that just so happens to be very similar to Christianity and seems to be based on actual ancient Egyptian texts and images. I'm mindful of the time. I did have an example of the role of food offerings. I'll just describe very quickly. Why did the Egyptians give food offerings? In the early 19th century, that there was no particular religious motivation. It was just a parallel to a commemorative feast in other cultures. In the mid-19th century, it was understood as expiatory sacrifices given to the church, serving to shorten the purgatorial transmigrations of the soul. So very much on that model of sort of Christianity and practices of giving alms and indulgences in order to shorten the stay in purgatory. And then in the late 19th century, the interpretation has shifted to everything that was put in the tomb being meant for the salvation of the dead. So if the dead was given food, it's because they needed it for their salvation and eternal life, which again is pretty much what the explanation we have today. I think we can skip this and return to our initial question about the balance between European and ancient Egyptian conceptual frameworks. As we've seen, the ancient Egyptian ideas that might be found in the ancient Egyptian sources were always quite narrowly circumscribed by the European expectations. This is especially true in the universalizing and familiarizing frameworks where deliberate parallels were established, but it's even the case in othering approaches that they tended in practice to support that kind of effect of circumscribing how we can understand the Egyptian sources. And by the time the indigenous concepts and imagery came to play a role in the mid to late 19th century, the overall framework had long been established, and there was an expectation to find very particular ideas, and they sort of latched on to the ancient Egyptian imagery. And another important finding is that ideas that we would now consider wrong, such as metempsychosis, were not dropped for lack of evidence, as we might tend to expect, but rather due to their conceptual redundancy. So one might have expected a tension between the two frameworks, the European and the Egyptian framework, but the late 19th century afterlife model that in many ways is still with us today was, on the one hand, intuitive enough to be very rarely questioned. It just makes sense that people in ancient Egypt would be interested in the same kind of things that people were in the 19th century, eternal life, salvation of the soul, that sort of thing. And on the other hand, the framework was also capacious enough to incorporate any empirical findings. So you can easily say, oh, looks like the Egyptians did lots of food offerings. We can fit that in. Apparently, they needed food to sustain eternal life. So with that conclusion, I want to thank you very much for your attention and apologize for going slightly over time.